Imagine being a renowned lawyer at your time, but because Thomas Jefferson was your nemesis, in death, you got eclipsed by him because Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence. We all know that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, but there's a lesser known founding father who was at the Constitutional Convention. His name was Luther Martin. He died same year, 1826, but it was July 10th. This is what Luther Martin had to say about himself. I am the same Luther Martin who through life has been, as far as in his power, the sincere friend of distress and the sworn foe of oppression, from whatever quarter it may come, in whatever form it may appear. I imagine that the American public were still mourning the deaths of former presidents John Adams and Thomas Jefferson to really notice or care about the former Attorney General Luther Martin. But throughout his career, at the Constitutional Convention, Luther Martin, he was a major states' right advocate, and one of his greatest contributions to the U.S. Constitution was the Supremacy Clause, which is kind of funny and ironic considering he was taken a little bit out of context, okay, when this clause came to place. Allow me to read a little bit from Luther Martin's biography, because Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut, who was also at the Constitutional Convention, had this to say to Luther Martin when they were writing letters to each other. You, Martin, originated that clause in the Constitution. You voted that an appeal should lay to the Supreme Judiciary of the United States. These are among the greater positive virtues you exhibited in the convention. And a historian, Max Farren, who wrote the framing of the Constitution of the United States, had this to say. Contrary to Martin's intentions, that resolution, with a single significant change, developed into one of the all important articles of the Constitution, strengthening the national government. Luther Martin was also one of Samuel Chase's lawyers during the Samuel Chase impeachment trial. Samuel Chase was a justice on the Supreme Court justice that Thomas Jefferson wanted to get impeached. But because Luther Martin had a vendetta against Thomas Jefferson, Luther Martin came to his friend's rescue. Henry Adams, a descendant of the President John Adams, had this to say. If any student of American history curious to test the relative value of reputation will read Randolph's opening address and then pass on to the argument of Luther Martin. He will feel the distance between show and strength, between intellectual brightness and intellectual strength. During the Aaron Burr treason trial, Luther Martin was once again present, and Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Monroe's son-in-law, George Hay, shall we move to commit Luther Martin, this unprincipled and impudent federal bulldog? Like I mentioned before, Luther Martin was at the Constitutional Convention, so he kind of had an idea of what treason against the United States meant, and I did speak a little bit about the whole Aaron Burr treason trial in a previous video, so you can check that out if you want. After Luther Martin successfully defended Aaron Burr during the treason trial, many years later, when Luther Martin was old and penniless, Aaron Burr took Luther Martin into his home where Luther Martin would die in New York. So I guess that was a show of gratitude for an old friend. So why do I say that Thomas Jefferson was Luther Martin's nemesis, that Luther Martin had a vendetta against Thomas Jefferson? This goes back to 1785 when Thomas Jefferson wrote a book called Notes of the State of Virginia. This was supposed to be a book talking about flora, fauna, a little bit of Virginia history for the French people, just for the French to get an idea of what the states was like out in America. And also within that book, and a part of Virginia's history was Lord Dunmore's War. So there was a group of white settlers, George Roger Clark among them, who wanted to make a settlement in Ohio and Kentucky, but they needed a Native American interpreter. And they thought that Michael Crisapp was their man because Michael Crisapp, he was a well-known frontiersman and had a good relationship with the Native Americans in that region. Michael Crisapp, who will eventually become Luther Martin's future father-in-law, he advised these white settlers saying this would not be a good idea at this time, but there is a upcoming conference with the Native Americans in that region, and he didn't want to participate in this conference because one of the chiefs tried to kill his own father, Thomas Crisapp, and so Michael Crisapp, he thought that he would probably lose his temper, and so he decided to skip out on this meetup. While Michael Crisapp was canoeing down the Ohio River, he got a message from one of Lord Dunmore's agents telling him that the group of white settlers who had George Roger Clark in, that group of white settlers was supposed to protect the white citizens out in the frontier because everyone was living on edge. The white people didn't know when the Native Americans will attack and vice versa. While he was getting this message, he witnessed a group of Shawnee Native Americans canoeing on the other side of the Ohio River. They got fired upon by white people. And so, in all this chaos, it was just Mike Crisapp. He was like, I do not want to be part of this. And he decided to retreat back up to Pennsylvania because he had a small settlement there. Within this time period, there was a Native American who I cannot say his name properly, so I will use his name that he chose for himself, Logan. While all so many different skirmishes were happening, his family got massacred, and Logan was rightfully upset about this. While Thomas Jefferson was writing his book, Notes of the State of Virginia, he mistakenly thought that Michael Crisapp was part of the group of white settlers that massacred Logan's family, which was not true because Michael Crisapp was up in Pennsylvania away from all the chaos that was happening during Dunmore's War. After Jefferson published his book, this ruined Michael Crisapp's reputation as being a peaceful frontiersman with the Native Americans. And well, the Crescent family tried fighting this, but because it was Thomas Jefferson who wrote this book, I mean, like, what can you possibly? How can you fight this? So when Luther Martin married into the Crescent family, he took it upon himself to defend his father-in-law's reputation because honor was a huge asset during this time period. Luther Martin began writing letters to Thomas Jefferson, and in one of them he said, one of two things only with property could you have done, either justified your publication or acknowledged your error. That the first was not in your power, I knew, and for the last, I did not believe you to possess sufficient candor. Luther Martin's letters to Thomas Jefferson were ignored for the most part because Thomas Jefferson was trying to find evidence to prove that he was right in saying that Michael Crisapp was part of the massacre that killed Logan's family, which ultimately he could not. And this went on for months and months and months to the point where, I mean, like, it eventually died down in the newspapers because Luther Martin's letters were published in the newspapers. But that's when Luther Martin decided to pledge eternal animosity towards Thomas Jefferson because it was very important to him, Luther Martin, to defend his now deceased father in law.